In the autumn of 1878, in the high country above the Uncompahgre River in western Colorado, a woman named Dora Cale arrived at the assay office in the mining camp of Ridgecut with $17.30 in her coat pocket, a dead husband's surveying compass on a cord around her neck, and nothing else that the law would have recognized as belonging to her. She was 27 years old. She had walked 11 miles down from a canyon called Caldera Draw, following the wagon road that switched back and forth along the river's eastern bank, through stands of scrub oak gone the color of dried blood, and past the rusted hulks of equipment that other men had freighted up the canyon in better seasons and left when the better seasons ended. The road was cold, and the sky above the canyon rim was the pale gray-white of old ash. The soles of her boots had worn thin enough that she could feel the road's frost through the leather, a dull, numbering cold that worked from her feet upward through most of the 11 miles. Ridgecut wasn't a proper town yet, though it called itself one. It was a collection of board and batten buildings set along a single unpaved street, with a smelter stack visible above the rooflines to the north and the sound of a stamp mill reaching the street from somewhere further up the drainage, a rhythmic concussion that did not stop, that the men who lived there had long since stopped hearing. The assay office shared a building with the land recorder's office and a notary public who was never present when the notary's services were needed. A sign above the window listed all three functions in faded black paint. The men at the assay window looked at her, and then looked at each other. Women did not arrive at the Ridgecut assay office alone in October. Women did not arrive alone at any hour, as a general principle, and the women who came to Ridgecut at all were usually the wives of men who had preceded them and arranged things in advance. Women did not ask, as she did, to review the filed survey plats for the upper Uncompahgre drainage. The clerk, whose name was Sim Bodell, had a young man's face and a practiced expression of administrative regret. He told her those records were for registered claim holders only. She told him her husband had been a registered claim holder. She told him his name. Bodell went back to his cabinet and was gone long enough that she had time to study the map pinned to the wall behind the counter, a hand-colored territorial survey sheet that showed the drainage basins in tan and the claim boundaries in red ink, dense as a cross-hatching along the creek drainages where the ore had proven out. What she did not yet know, standing at that window with her cracked boot soles and her dead husband's compass, was that the answer to every question that had driven her 11 miles down that canyon road was already filed in that cabinet, in a set of survey documents that nobody had asked to see in nearly 2 years. If you have ever inherited something you did not know how to open, you will understand what came next. Stay with this story. The compass had belonged to Emmett Cale, who had married Dora Whitmore in a church outside of Gunnison 4 years before this October. Emmett had been a surveyor by training, the son of a surveyor, and he had learned his craft from a man named August Whitmore, who was Dora's own father. That coincidence, which was not really a coincidence at all, was how Emmett and Dora had found each other. They were two people who had grown up reading land the same way, through a transit and a chain, through the patient triangulation of points that would not move. August Whitmore had surveyed half the drainage basins in Gunnison County in the years after the war, working for the territorial government and then for himself, recording his notes in a series of field books bound in black oilcloth that he replaced every 2 years when the fieldwork had filled them. He had a precise hand and a deliberate method. He wrote every bearing to the nearest quarter degree, glossed every monument's location with a sketch and a prose description, and cross-checked every closure before he ever signed a sheet. He had taught Dora to do the same, beginning when she was 9 years old and could barely see over the edge of the transit's eyepiece, because he had no sons and because he was a practical man who believed that knowledge dispensed to children was not diminished by their gender. She had been permitted to carry the field books, but not to keep them. because they were her father's work and her father's property, and the law of Colorado in 1878 regarded them as such. She had read them, though. She had read every page of every book her father had written, standing at his elbow as a girl while he drafted lines that turned into land and land that turned into claims, and later as a young woman while she carried the chain and ran the measurement calls and recorded the bearings in her own notebook that she kept alongside his. She knew what a discrepancy in a survey line looked like. She knew what a transposed corner monument meant, the way a wrong assumption could propagate across an entire plat, while looking, to a careless eye, exactly correct. She knew because her father had taught her and because she had paid attention, that errors in survey work did not disappear when the survey was filed. They waited. Emmett had staked a placer claim in Caldera Draw in the spring of 1876. He had done it carefully, as he did everything, driving his corner posts at the legally required distance, tying his monuments to a named rock formation on the canyon's east wall, filing his paperwork at the Territorial Land Office in Denver before he drove a single drift into the gravel. The corner posts were cut from lodgepole pine, peeled and squared, driven to a depth of 2 feet into the canyon floor, and capped with a blaze cut on the face and Emmett's initials and the claim's filing number burned into the wood with a running iron. He had set them in the first week of April, when the stream was still running loud with snowmelt and the canyon smelled of cold stone and wet pine needles, and he had checked each one against the compass before he moved to the next. The claim was 300 feet along the stream and 50 feet on each side, in a section of the draw where the gravel ran shallow and the bedrock showed itself in places as a gray-green schist that Emmett had recognized from his training as a likely host for sulfide ores. He had described it in his field notes as chloritic greenstone with quartz intrusion, which was the technical language, and then written beneath that, in the smaller personal hand he used for observations that were not strictly required, "It looks like the right country." He had been right. The gravel had not yielded much on washing, 8 or 10 colors to the pan on a good day, enough to tell him the gravel was not the prize. The schist had been something else. Over 14 months of work he had driven a small adit into the east wall of the canyon, following a seam of quartz that averaged 18 inches wide and carried visible free gold in the vugs and pockets, and under the assay lamp a satisfying density of silver sulfide that blued the quartz surface in patterns his father-in-law would have recognized immediately as a sign of real depth. The seam was not erratic. It held its width and its values through 40 feet of horizontal drift, which was enough for any experienced miner to understand that this was not a surface enrichment, not a gossened cap over barren rock below. It was a true vein. By August of 1877, he had extracted enough ore to know the seam was real and deep, and not a pocket. He had not extracted enough to protect himself. In September of 1877, a man named Harlan Price arrived in Caldera Draw. Price was the agent for a Denver mining syndicate called the Consolidated Territorial Ore Company, and he arrived not with a gun or a deed of transfer, but with something more durable than either. It was a survey report prepared by a licensed territorial surveyor named Ogden Cates, which stated that Emmett Cale's corner monuments were misaligned, that his claim boundary as physically staked on the ground did not correspond to the boundaries as filed, and that the adit Emmett had driven into the canyon wall fell by a margin of 11 feet outside his own legal claim. That 11 feet was worth, by Price's own estimate at the time, somewhere in the range of $40,000. Price presented the survey to Emmett in a way that was scrupulously polite, which was how he presented all difficult things. He said that there was obviously some confusion in the original filing, and that the company's survey was intended purely to clarify the matter and not to impugn anyone's good faith. He said that the company would of course give Mr. Cale full opportunity to respond to the findings, He spoke in the flat, even tone of a man who had made this kind of visit many times before, and who knew that a certain kind of politeness was harder to argue with than a threat. Emmett disputed the survey. He wrote to the land office. He hired an attorney in Delta on credit, a young man named Ferris who had not yet been in practice long enough to know how rarely a small claimants contest succeeded against a syndicate with Denver attorneys. Emmett had the corner posts remeasured by a local man, a fence builder named Tuck Ames, who knew enough about survey work to walk a chain and read a compass, but not enough to find what needed finding. Ames walked the claim boundaries twice, read his compass at each corner, and reported that the measurements looked right to him, which was true, because they were right. The error was not in the measurements. The measurements had been accurate to what they purported to measure. The fence builder had no way to know that what they purported to measure was the wrong thing. The attorney's letters did not help. The land office in Denver acknowledged the dispute and noted that a licensed survey superseded a claimant's assertion and that Mr. Cale should file a formal contest with supporting survey evidence within 90 days. Emmett Cale did not file the contest. In November of 1877, he contracted pneumonia working the adit in the cold and wet of late autumn, when the canyon held water on its walls and the adit entrance dripped with snowmelt that seeped through the fractured schist above. He was dead before December. Dora buried him on a bench above the draw, in ground that was cold and hard and smelled of pine sap and iron. She had wrapped him in the canvas she had used as a door for the lean-to, which was the best material she had. The grave took her 2 days to dig, because the ground resisted her in the way that frozen ground resists everything, not with force but with simple indifference. 2 men from a claim further up the canyon came to help fill it, though they had not come to dig, and they stood with their hats in their hands afterward and said the things men said, and were gone within the hour. She was 6 months into a pregnancy that did not survive the winter. In February, she had nothing left in the canyon. The lean-to was Price's Company's now, or they said it was, and the adit was Price's Company's, and the road down to the valley had drifted with snow that made it impassable for 2 weeks in January, so that she was alone with the silence of the canyon and the specific sound of the creek running under ice, and the knowledge that everything Emmett had built was gone, or being taken. She walked out when the road was passable, with what she could carry in a flour sack, which was the compass on its cord, the field books Emmett had left in the lean-to when he sickened, 3 changes of clothing, and a small wrap photograph of Emmett taken in a Gunnison studio the first summer they were married. She spent the spring and summer of 1878 in Gunnison, at the house of a woman named Petra Haas, who had known her mother and who took her in without asking for money she did not have. Petra was a widow herself, a German-born woman of 60 with square, capable hands and an economical way of expressing sympathy that Dora found, without being able to explain it, easier to bear than another woman might have been. Petra did not ask her to speak about Emmett or about the canyon. She fed her and gave her a room with a cot and a window facing east, and left her alone with her grief until the grief was ready to become something else. Dora took in laundry. She mended harness leather for the saddle shop 2 streets over, which paid in coin and was steady work. She repaired the calfskin binding on a set of survey field books for the county surveyor, who paid her for the work and mentioned in passing that she had done it better than the bookbinder in town. She thought in the long evenings about the survey dispute and about Ogden Cates and about the 11 feet that had taken everything Emmett had built, and she turned the problem the way her father had taught her to turn a discrepancy, not with anger, but with the patience of a person who is looking for the error in the line, who knows the error is there because the line is wrong, and who is simply working backward until she finds where it was introduced. In August, she walked into the Gunnison land office and asked politely to see a copy of the Cates survey report. The clerk found it in the records without difficulty, which she had expected, because it was a filed public document that she had every right to examine. She sat at the reading table by the window that faced the street and spread the report flat and read it the way her father had taught her to read a survey, beginning not with the measurements but with the datum, the fixed point from which all other points were derived, because if the datum was wrong, then everything that followed from it was wrong, no matter how correctly the arithmetic had been done. She found the error in 40 minutes. She spent the remaining 80 minutes confirming it 3 ways, working each confirmation on a separate sheet of paper so that the numbers from one check did not bleed into another. The error was not in the measurements themselves. Cates had measured competently enough. The error was in the datum point he had used to establish the survey's origin. He had tied his survey to a formation he called the Saddle Rock, a 2-pronged granite outcrop on the canyon's east wall that he described in his field notes as distinctive in form and visible from the floor of the draw. The bearing he had recorded from the claim's southeast corner monument to the Saddle Rock was north 47 degrees east. That bearing was correct, in the sense that it was what his instrument had shown. What was not correct was the identification of the rock. There were 2 formations in the upper canyon that could be called a saddle shape, that shared the double-pronged granite silhouette that made the feature identifiable from a distance. They stood apart from each other by roughly 200 yards, the nearer one lower on the canyon wall and more readily visible from the creek bottom, the farther one higher and somewhat larger, set back against the gray cliff face in a way that made it less immediately conspicuous, but unmistakably the formation Emmett had described in his original filing, because his field notes specified not just the bearing, but the elevation angle, and the elevation angle matched the farther rock. Cates had tied his survey to the near one. Emmett, whose field notes Dora still carried inside her coat, had tied his original claim filing to the farther one. It was a span of 62 feet. Those 62 feet did not merely correct the 11-foot discrepancy that had displaced Emmett's adit. They moved the claim boundary far enough that the entirety of the adit and the seam it followed and another 40 feet of schist that no one had yet touched fell squarely inside Emmett's original filed claim. The Cates survey had measured the right distances from the wrong rock. Dora sat for a long time after she had confirmed the 3rd check, looking at the street through the reading room window. A wagon went by with a load of lumber. A dog followed the wagon for a portion of a block and then turned back. The numbers on the paper in front of her were correct. The conclusion wasn't something she could argue with, because she had built it from the ground up using only what was in the filed record, and the filed record was a public document that anyone could see. The question wasn't whether she was right. The question was how to demonstrate it in a form that would compel the land office to act. And that question had only one answer: a resurvey done in the field by someone licensed to certify the result. Dora folded her notes into her coat pocket, thanked the clerk, and walked back to Petra Haas's house. She sat at the kitchen table and thought for a long time about what it would take to prove what she had found. Proving it required a licensed survey done by hand, in the field, in the canyon, tying the corrected datum point to every corner monument Emmett had driven, and doing it before the winter closed the high country again. She had $17. A licensed surveyor would cost 3 times that for a single day's work. She sat with the problem until she understood what she already owned. She owned her father's training, which was a specific and exact thing, not a general familiarity, but a working knowledge of transit compass operation, chain measurement, vernier reading, monument identification, and field note preparation that she had practiced alongside August Whitmore for the better part of 10 years. She owned Emmett's compass, which was a girly transit compass, brass-fitted and box-mounted, with a vernier plate accurate to the nearest half degree, and a spirit level that still held its bubble, which she had checked because she checked everything before she relied on it. She owned the field books Emmett had left in the canyon's lean-to when he sickened, which Price's men had apparently not thought worth taking, perhaps because they were dense with notations in a technical hand that required training to parse, and that, to a layman, looked like the private scrawlings of a man who was overly careful about record-keeping. They had left the most important thing behind because they did not know how to read it. She owned the knowledge, from her father's years of work, of how to set a transit compass on a monument, shoot a bearing, read a vernier, and record a legal field note in a form that would hold up against examination. She knew the procedure from its first step to its last. She had never done it alone, without her father or Emmett standing beside her, but the procedure did not change because of that. The instrument did not know whose hands were on it. Colorado territorial law in 1878 required that a survey used to contest a filed claim be conducted by a licensed surveyor. Dora was not licensed. She had never sat for the examination because the examination was not available to women in Colorado in 1878, a fact that the law had not found worth specifying because it had not occurred to the men who wrote the law that specification would be necessary. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Denver. She explained the datum error in full, attaching her own calculations showing the 62-foot discrepancy. She asked what precisely the law required to validate a corrected survey filed in a claim contest. The response came 3 weeks later, written in the careful language of a man who had thought about what he was saying before he wrote it. A licensed surveyor must supervise and certify the field work. The field measurements and field notes could be compiled by any competent assistant. She read that response 3 times. Then she wrote to Casper Bloom in Montrose. Bloom was 61 years old, a small, quiet man with a gray beard trimmed close to the jaw and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that he was constantly losing in his breast pocket and then finding again with the air of mild surprise that comes from having repeated an action so many times it has ceased to be worth being annoyed by. He had surveyed mining claims in Colorado since 1862, when the territory was still finding its shape, and he had in that time seen 2 datum errors of the kind Dora described, which was 2 more than most surveyors encountered in a career. He had not believed her when she wrote to him, not fully, because the error she described required a specific and embarrassing kind of mistake from a licensed man, and Ogden Cates had a respectable record. He had believed her enough to answer her letter, and then to read her calculations, and then, after a long evening with those calculations, to write back and say that he would come, and that they would discuss payment when he knew what the survey showed. She came back to Caldera Draw at the end of September, with Bloom riding behind her on a hired horse, his transit in its wooden case strapped to the saddlebag, and his field camera wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. The lean-to was still standing. Someone had gone through it in the months she had been away, but Emmett's field books had not been moved, which confirmed what she had suspected. Price's people had not known what they were looking at. He believed her by the second day in the canyon, when he stood at the southeast corner monument with her notes and her dead husband's compass and sighted the bearing she had calculated, and the far saddle rock came into alignment at exactly the angle the original filed claim required. He moved the instrument to each of the other 3 corner monuments in turn and read the bearing to both formations from each position. The numbers were consistent. The nearer rock and the farther rock gave different results at every station, and at every station the farther rock matched what Emmett had filed. He stood for a while without speaking. The canyon was cold and smelled of juniper and the thin mineral smell of exposed schist, and the creek below them ran over its stones with the particular thin sound it made in late September. when the water was low and the stones were visible through it. 62 feet, he said finally. 62 and a half, Dora said, not looking up from her own notes. They spent 4 days in the canyon, working from first light until the sun dropped behind the canyon's west wall, and the temperature dropped sharply after it. Dora ran the chain while Bloom managed the transit, and she recorded every bearing and distance in the same cramped, clear hand her father had used, because her father had taught her and she had not forgotten. They ran each line twice, compared the 2 sets of numbers, and ran it a 3rd time when the first 2 disagreed by more than the allowable error. On the 2nd day, they found the southeast corner monument leaning, the post rotted at the base by 2 seasons of snowmelt, and they had to establish its original position by triangulation from the other 3 monuments and from a rock nail Emmett had driven into the canyon wall as a checkpoint. That calculation took most of the afternoon, and when she had finished it, Bloom checked her arithmetic without comment and then nodded once. On the 3rd day, while Bloom rested his back against a boulder and ate a piece of cold biscuit, she ran the final check on the corner-to-corner closure and found it short by 3/10 of a foot, which was within the tolerance the territorial office accepted. "That will hold," Bloom said, reading her numbers. He did not look surprised, which was, she thought, the best kind of confirmation. On the 4th day, they climbed to the 2 saddle rock formations together, working up the talus on the canyon's east wall in the cold morning light, and Bloom took photographs with his field camera, exposing 6 plates between the 2 formations and recording the exposure conditions in a small notebook he kept separate from his survey notes. Dora wrote descriptions of both formations that ran to 2 full pages each, naming the specific features in the precise formal language the land office required. She recorded the height of each prong, the separation between them, the compass bearing from base to apex, the grain and color of the granite, the lichen patterns on the south-facing surface, the distance between the 2 formations measured by chain from the southeast corner monument at the valley floor below. She wrote the descriptions with the care of someone who understood that the difference between a clear description and an ambiguous one was the difference between a contested record and a final one. The evidence was not a single thing. It was an accumulation of specific, verifiable facts that added up to only one conclusion. Ogden Cates had used the wrong rock, and every measurement that followed from that choice had followed correctly and arrived somewhere false. There is a kind of proof that does not shout. It simply sits in a pile and waits for someone with the patience to count it. It is worth pausing here, because the patience this required was not ordinary. Dora had spent a winter and most of a summer in near poverty, doing piecework in a borrowed room. She had walked 11 miles to a clerk who did not want to help her. She was working in a canyon where her husband had died, using tools her father had taught her and her husband had carried and left behind, in a lean-to that smelled of Emmett's tobacco and of the cold that had killed him. The cold that settled into Caldera Draw each evening in October was the same cold that had come into the attic in November of 1877. And she knew it by the way it moved, the damp mineral chill that the canyon held in its stone walls and released after dark. She did not allow herself to think about that too directly. She thought instead about the bearing numbers, about the closure arithmetic, about the precise language of the field notes she was writing by lamplight each night in the lean-to. The field notes were her work. They had to be right. That was the only thought that was useful. That is how some people survive what they are handed, not by refusing to feel it, but by finding something precise and demanding to do with their hands, and doing it with absolute attention. On the 5th morning, Bloom signed and sealed the completed survey. He shook her hand in a way that was more formal than he had intended, and she understood that he was doing it because he could not think of a better way to say what the handshake meant. She rode back to Ridgecut with the survey report and field notes in a canvas satchel. She had been gone 6 days. In that time, the Consolidated Territorial Ore Company had sent a rider to the canyon, and the rider had reported back that a woman and an old man were surveying the claim boundaries, and Harlan Price had sent a letter by the same rider to the land office in Denver, asking what authority permitted a claimant's widow to commission a resurvey of a disputed claim. The land office's answer arrived 4 days after Dora filed her contest. The answer was that territorial law permitted any person with a legal interest in a mining claim to file a contest on new survey evidence. Emmett Cale's widow held an inherited legal interest in Emmett Cale's claim. The contest was valid. Price came to Ridgecut himself in late October. He was a lean man of about 50, with the manner of someone who had spent a career explaining to people why they were wrong in ways that made them feel they had agreed to it. He asked to see Dora at the hotel, and Petra Haas, who had come to Ridgecut with her because Dora had not asked her not to, sat in the corner of the room and said nothing for the entire meeting. Price told Dora that the contest would be expensive to pursue through the land office. He told her that the Consolidated Territorial Ore Company had significant resources and a history of successful claim disputes. He told her that he was authorized to offer her a settlement in the amount of $800 for the withdrawal of her contest. Dora let him finish. Then she asked him very quietly whether he had read the field notes she had filed. He said he had reviewed the summary. She asked whether he had walked to the canyon and looked at both formations himself. He had not. She suggested that he do so before he came back with another offer, because she believed when he had done that, he would understand that the survey she had filed was not the work of a woman who would accept $800. He left. He did not come back. The land office in Denver assigned the contest to a review examiner, a man named Thaddeus Oren, who traveled to Caldera Draw in November with his own surveyor and spent 3 days in the canyon measuring and photographing the two Saddle Rock formations. He stood between them with Dora's field notes in one hand and the Cates survey in the other. He was in the canyon for one more day than he had planned. Oren's report to the land office was submitted on the 14th of December, 1878. It ran to 11 pages. Its conclusion occupied a single paragraph. The Cates survey had established its datum at the nearer and incorrect of two similarly configured granite formations, introducing a systematic error of 62 5/10 feet into all subsequent measurements, such that the boundaries as staked on the ground did not correspond to the boundaries as originally filed. The contest filed by Mrs. Emmett Cale was sustained. Her deceased husband's claim, as originally filed and now correctly surveyed, was restored in full. The adit fell inside it by 41 feet. The Consolidated Territorial Ore Company disputed the ruling through their attorneys for another 8 months, filing 2 appeals and a request for a new field examination. Both appeals were denied. The new field examination found the same thing the first one had found. In August of 1879, the company's last appeal was dismissed by the Territorial Court in Denver. The claim belonged formally and finally to the estate of Emmett Cale, of which his widow Dora Cale was the sole heir. She had by that time entered into a working agreement with a small mining partnership out of Montrose, 2 brothers named Vail, who had the equipment and the capital to develop the adit properly. The agreement gave Dora a 1/3 interest in any production from the claim, in exchange for the right to work it. She had negotiated the terms herself, at a table in the Ridgecut Hotel, with Casper Bloom present as a witness because she trusted his judgment, and he had agreed to come. The Vail brothers had asked for 1/4. She had asked for 3/8. They had settled at 1/3, and she had shaken hands on it without changing her expression. The seam that Emmett had found and that the Cates survey had briefly and illegally transferred to the Consolidated Territorial Ore Company ran deep into the canyon wall, The schist that hosted it was a consistent formation, not a pocket, not a pinch-out, but a true vein of quartz carrying free gold and silver sulfide at values that the Montrose Assayer, when the first ton of ore came out, described in his report as extraordinary. He then crossed out that word and wrote substantial, because he was a careful man. Over the following 3 years, the Caldera Draw claim produced enough silver and gold to make it, by the assessment records of Ouray County, one of the most productive small-scale hard rock mines in the upper Uncompahgre drainage. Dora did not become wealthy in the way that word is usually meant. She became solvent and then comfortable. And then, after the second full year of production, something that had no precise name in the vocabulary available to her, which was simply the state of not being afraid of the winter anymore. She bought the land above the claim, a 40-acre parcel that included the bench where she had buried Emmett, in the spring of 1880. She built a small house there, a 2-room structure of squared logs with a south-facing window that looked down into the draw. She put in a kitchen garden. She kept 2 horses. In the evenings, she sometimes sat at the south window with a set of survey plats spread on the table, not because there was work to do, but because the act of reading land that way, line by line and bearing by bearing, was the closest thing she had to the sound of her father's voice. Caspar Bloom rode out to see her in the summer of 1880. Having come from a survey job in the San Juans, he sat on the bench in front of the house and drank coffee and looked down into the draw, where the Vail brothers' headframe was visible above the added entrance. He asked her how she had been certain enough to come back to the canyon with only $17 and a transit compass. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "My father used to say that a survey error does not hide," she said. "It just waits for someone to look." Bloom nodded slowly. "He was right about that," he said. She agreed. Then she picked up the survey plat she had been studying and went back to tracing the line. There is a particular kind of knowledge that passes from hand to hand and is worth nothing until the moment when it is the only thing standing between a person and losing everything. August Whitmore had spent 30 years reading land, and he had given what he knew to his daughter the way he gave her everything else, quietly and with the expectation that she would use it. She had used it at 27 years old, alone in a canyon in October, with worn boot soles in a sealed cabinet of survey records, and the specific memory of how her father's voice had sounded when he explained to her, for the second time because she had asked him to explain it again, that there was only one right way to tie a survey to the earth, and that way was to the thing that did not move. The Consolidated Territorial Ore Company filed no further claims in Ouray County. Harlan Price left Colorado in 1879 and relocated to Utah, where the records do not follow him. Ogden Cates continued to practice as a licensed surveyor until 1883, when he was censured by the Territorial Land Office on an unrelated matter involving a boundary dispute in Mesa County. The censure was brief and the records of it are thin. The compass that Emmett Cale had carried in Caldera Draw, and that Dora had worn on a cord around her neck through the autumn and winter and spring of that longest year, hung on a peg by the south window of the log house until the house was taken down in 1921. The woman who took it down was Dora's niece, a girl named Clara, who did not know what it had been used for. Clara kept the compass for the rest of her life. She said later that it had belonged to a surveyor, which was true, though only partly. It had also belonged to the woman who had known how to use it at the moment when everything depended on that knowledge, and who had used it without flinching, and who had not asked anyone's permission to do so. The richest vein in the upper Uncompahgre drainage did not belong to a woman who had inherited it or been given it or stumbled onto it. It belonged to a woman who had read the error in the line that had taken it from her husband, walked 11 miles to a records office, sat down with a dead man's field notes, and done the arithmetic herself. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. There is another story waiting, about a woman who bought an abandoned thing the world had written off entirely, and what she found inside it when she opened it with her own hands. The south window of that small log house looked down into Caldera Draw for 41 years. In the evenings, when the light came low from the west and caught the rock face where the headframe stood, the schist lit up green gold in the last of it, the same color it had been when Emmett had first held a piece of it in his hand and known what it meant. Dora had seen that light every autumn evening from the bench where she sat with her coffee, and she had never once stopped looking at it because it was the color of a thing that had been found.